Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. When I look at the direct phone call between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump on the Taiwan issue, I do not see it as a routine diplomatic exchange. I see it as a strategic moment, a subtle recalibration in the relationship between the world's two largest powers, one that has profound implications for regional stability, global markets, and the future of U.S.-China relations. Taiwan has long been the most dangerous flashpoint in East Asia, but when the leaders of China and the United States engage directly on it, the stakes are elevated to a level that demands careful, sober analysis. Let me begin with a simple truth. Great powers do not call each other casually about Taiwan. When Xi picks up the phone, it is with purpose. When Trump responds, it is with calculation, and the world listens. For Xi, the call is not merely about diplomacy, it is about reaffirming China's red lines. He wants Trump to understand unmistakably that Beijing's position has not shifted. Taiwan is a core national interest. Independence is unacceptable. U.S. political signals, arms sales, or military deployments that appear to embolden Taipei will be treated as provocations. Xi's approach is rooted in long-term strategy. China sees the Taiwan issue as central to its national rejuvenation project, and Xi must demonstrate firmness not only to Washington, but to domestic elites and the People's Liberation Army. His message is consistent. There are boundaries the U.S. must not cross. Trump, however, enters the conversation with a very different mindset. He views international relations not as a system of rules or alliances, but as a field of transactions where leverage matters more than principles. Taiwan, in Trump's eyes, is a strategic asset, important but also negotiable. He may praise Taiwan's democracy publicly, while privately considering its value in bargaining with Beijing on trade supply chains, technology, or global influence. This is what makes the call so delicate. Xi expects clarity. Trump thrives on ambiguity. Xi wants commitments. Trump wants options. From my perspective, this is a recipe for misunderstanding one of the most dangerous ingredients in geopolitics. If Trump signals too much support for Taiwan, China interprets it as containment. If he signals too little, Taiwan feels abandoned. If he uses Taiwan as leverage, Beijing sees manipulation and prepares counter pressure. In this sense, the call is not simply an exchange of views. It is a test of how each leader interprets the intentions of the other. And the timing matters. The global economy is fragile. Supply chains are vulnerable. Semiconductor dependence on Taiwan is deep. Financial markets react instantly to geopolitical signals, especially around the Taiwan Strait. A tense or ambiguous call could set off waves of uncertainty far beyond Asia. In my analysis, this conversation is a microcosm of the broader U.S.-China relationship, two powers navigating rivalry in an interconnected world, each constrained by domestic politics, each determined not to appear weak, facing a flashpoint where miscalculation could lead to catastrophic consequences. The Xi-Trump call is therefore not just diplomacy, it is a warning, a reminder that the world's equilibrium now rests on the ability of these two leaders to manage one of the most combustible issues of our era with restraint, clarity, and a sense of responsibility to the global community. When I try to understand Donald Trump's approach to Taiwan, especially in light of Xi Jinping's call, I have to start with a core insight. Trump doesn't think of Taiwan as a strategist. He thinks of it as a negotiator. In Trump's worldview, Taiwan is less a partner bound by shared democratic values and more a lever in a larger competition with China for economic power, technological superiority, and geopolitical influence. Trump has always been a transactionalist. He sees diplomacy as bargaining alliances, as tools, and geopolitical issues as opportunities to extract concessions. Taiwan is no exception. For Trump, the island's strategic value lies not just in its democracy or its semiconductor industry, but in its ability to provide Washington with something to trade or threaten in times of tension with Beijing. This is why Xi's call is so important. Xi seeks clarity. Trump prefers ambiguity. Xi wants assurances of U.S. commitments. Trump wants flexibility. Xi demands predictability. Trump thrives on unpredictability. From this asymmetry emerges the core tension in the appeal. Let me break down Trump's possible strategic calculation into three parts. First, Trump knows that getting tough on China plays particularly well in U.S. domestic politics. Anti-China sentiment has become one of the few bipartisan themes in Washington. Trump sees Taiwan as a symbolic tool to project power through arms sales, naval patrols, or high-level phone calls without necessarily forcing the U.S. to incur heavy losses defending the island in the event of war. So he will likely deliver tough talk at home, emphasizing that the U.S. will never bow to Beijing. But rhetoric is not policy, and Trump understands that war in the Taiwan Strait would be catastrophic for the U.S. economy, markets, and global supply chains. Second, Trump sees Taiwan as leverage in negotiations over trade technology and economic decoupling. If China wants the United States to reduce its support for Taipei or limit arms sales or reduce political engagement, Trump can suggest that certain concessions from Beijing could influence U.S. behavior. In other words, Taiwan would become a bargaining chip, something Xi Jinping fears deeply. This is why the call is likely to include sharp statements from Beijing to warn Trump that Taiwan is not a negotiating issue, but a core interest that China will not compromise. Third, Trump believes in using pressure as a starting point for deals. We should expect him to increase the U.S. naval presence around Taiwan, accelerate arms sales, or publicly support Taipei while avoiding any clear commitment to defend Taiwan militarily. This hesitation, pressure without clarity, is typical of Trump. It creates uncertainty for China, anxiety for Taiwan, and strategic risk for the entire region. This, in my view, is where the danger lies. If Trump treats Taiwan as an asset to be traded rather than a society of 23 million people whose safety is at stake, the risk of miscalculation is much higher. China may mistake Trump's unpredictability for provocation. Taiwan may mistake Trump's symbolic gestures for reassurance. Markets may interpret Trump's ambiguity as instability. Ultimately, Trump's Taiwan calculus is defined by short-term leverage, not long-term strategy. And in a region as fragile as the Taiwan Strait, the gap between leverage and strategy may be the most dangerous risk. When I think about how Trump will manage the aftermath of his call with Xi Jinping, the central issue that emerges is the interplay between deterrence and ambiguity, two tools that have long defined U.S. strategy toward Taiwan. But Trump's use of these tools is fundamentally different from that of previous administrations. Traditional U.S. policy has relied on a careful balance. Reassure Taiwan, deter China, but avoid making commitments so explicit that they provoke conflict. Trump, however, brings a volatility to this balance that magnifies the risks. In Trump's mind, deterrence is primarily a display of strength, military capacity, economic leverage, unpredictable signaling. He believes that showing force-sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait, approving major arms sales, or making assertive statements will keep China off balance. But deterrence without clarity can become provocation, especially when dealing with a country like China, which views the Taiwan issue as existential. Strategic ambiguity has been a cornerstone of U.S. policy for decades. The U.S. does not say explicitly whether it would defend Taiwan, and that uncertainty restrains both sides. Trump, however, uses ambiguity differently. Rather than preserving stability, he uses uncertainty as bargaining leverage. He wants China to wonder what Washington might do to fear escalation, to feel pressure. But China interprets this as manipulation, not strategy, and that is where the danger lies. After the Xi-Trump call, I anticipate a dual-track approach from Trump, a combination of cold reassurance and hot signaling. On one track, Trump will likely adopt a tone of stability in public statements. He may tell the press that the call was productive, that China understands America's position, and that tensions are under control. This is a classic Trump reassure markets, calm investors, and give the appearance of diplomatic success. On the second track, however, Trump will almost certainly escalate pressure. He may authorize new arms packages for Taiwan, more advanced missiles, more surveillance technology, more cyber defense cooperation. He may increase U.S. naval or aerial patrols in the region, framing them as routine freedom of navigation operations. He may send a high-profile American delegation to Taipei or approve more bilateral economic initiatives. These dual moves, public calm paired with private escalation, reflect Trump's belief that unpredictability gives him leverage, but unpredictability is precisely what increases the risk of miscalculation. From China's perspective, Trump's posture is dangerous. Beijing's military reads ambiguous. U.S. moves through the lens of worst-case scenarios. If Washington increases its presence near Taiwan without clear messaging, China may assume the U.S. is preparing for a larger strategic shift. Xi cannot afford to appear weak, especially when domestic nationalism is rising and the PLA is increasingly assertive. Ambiguous U.S. signals risk triggering mirror image escalation from Beijing. Taiwan, meanwhile, receives mixed messages. Trump's gestures might appear supportive, but Taipei knows that Trump's commitments are fluid, transactional, and deeply tied to domestic U.S. politics. Taiwan fears abandonment as much as it fears entanglement. And then there is the economic risk. Markets are highly sensitive to U.S.-China tensions around Taiwan. Semiconductor supply chains, shipping lanes, and investor psychology all respond instantly to signals from Washington and Beijing. A single ambiguous statement, a naval encounter, or an unscripted Trump remark could shake global markets in minutes. In this volatile environment, I see Trump's management of deterrence and ambiguity as a high-stakes gamble. For Trump, the ambiguity is a tool. For China, it is a threat. For Taiwan, it is existential uncertainty. For the world economy, it is a source of systemic fragility. This is why the Xi-Trump call matters so profoundly. Deterrence without clarity and ambiguity, without strategy, may be the most dangerous combination in the Taiwan Strait. When I examine the Xi-Trump phone call from Taiwan's vantage point, the picture becomes far more emotionally charged and existentially complex. For Washington and Beijing, Taiwan is a strategic issue. For Taiwan, it is survival, the survival of its democracy, its autonomy, its economic vitality, and even its physical safety. Taipei has learned over many decades that its fate is often shaped not by its own actions, but by the decisions of great powers who treat the island as a pressure point in their rivalry. This is the tragedy of Taiwan's strategic position. It lives in a permanent state of uncertainty, never fully confident in U.S. protection, nor fully capable of deterring China on its own. When Xi calls Trump to reiterate China's red lines, Taiwan listens with acute sensitivity. Taipei knows precisely what China wants from Washington: fewer arms sales, fewer political signals, fewer high-level contacts, and an implicit commitment that the United States will restrain Taiwan's political aspirations. And Taiwan also knows that Trump, unlike previous U.S. presidents, views Taiwan not as a long-term strategic partner, but as a variable, something he can adjust depending on what he wants from Beijing at any particular moment. Thus, after the call, Taiwan feels a dual fear of abandonment, that Trump might trade away support for Taiwan in exchange for concessions on trade or technology, fear of entrapment, that Trump might push China too hard, using Taiwan as leverage, exposing the island to retaliation it did not seek. This is the psychological burden of being a small democracy wedged between competing giants. Taiwan's government, of course, will respond with discipline. Taipei will publicly welcome continued U.S. engagement, emphasizing shared democratic values and the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. But privately, Taiwan will press Washington for more concrete commitments, not symbolic gestures, but tangible assets that enhance deterrence. These may include advanced missile systems, cybersecurity cooperation, integrated early warning networks, deeper intelligence sharing, expanded semiconductor and supply chain coordination. Taiwan understands that abstract reassurances mean very little in a crisis. What protects Taiwan is capability, not rhetoric. At the same time, Taiwan will intensify its own diplomatic outreach. Taipei knows that its security depends not only on U.S. backing, but also on the stance of regional players, chief among them Japan. Taiwan will quietly strengthen security dialogues with Tokyo, Canberra, and some Southeast Asian partners, hoping to weave a broader informal network of support. Another dimension often overlooked is Taiwan's economic anxiety. The semiconductor industry is the island's crown jewel, but it is also its greatest vulnerability. A conflict or even a major crisis could send shockwaves through global supply chains, destabilizing Taiwan's economy and eroding investor confidence. Every ambiguous signal from Washington triggers market calculations in Taipei. What concerns me most is the emotional toll on Taiwanese society. Living under constant military pressure from China is already destabilizing. Adding U.S. unpredictability to the equation deepens the sense of vulnerability. Taiwan's people watch every U.S.-China exchange with the knowledge that their future is being negotiated explicitly or implicitly by powers far larger than themselves. In the end, Taiwan is forced to walk a tightrope between hope and fear, between autonomy and dependence, between deterrence and vulnerability. The Xi-Trump call, therefore, is not just a diplomatic moment. It is another reminder of how precariously Taiwan's fate sits within the shifting tectonics of great power competition. When I shift the analytical lens to Japan, the Xi-Trump phone call takes on a different but equally profound significance. Japan is not a passive observer of the Taiwan question. It is a frontline stakeholder, economically, geographically, and strategically. No major country is more directly exposed to the consequences of a Taiwan crisis than Japan, and no U.S. ally must navigate a more delicate balance between deterrence and restraint. For Tokyo, the Xi-Trump call triggers an immediate question: is the U.S.-China rivalry moving towards stabilization or escalation? And crucially, can Japan trust Trump's management of this crisis? Japan has learned over the years that the stability of East Asia is inseparable from Taiwan's security. If Taiwan falls, Japan's southwestern islands, including Okinawa, would lie within China's expanded sphere of military dominance. Tokyo knows this, Beijing knows this, and Washington knows this. Japan's first instinct after the call is likely relief that communication is happening at all, because silence between Washington and Beijing is far more dangerous. But relief quickly gives way to skepticism, even concern. Tokyo understands Trump's unpredictability. It has seen him question alliances, threaten troop withdrawals, and treat security commitments as negotiable financial transactions. for Japan, this raises a chilling possibility. Could Trump treat Taiwan the same way, using its fate as part of a larger negotiation with China? Japan cannot afford to assume stability, so Tokyo's likely response will unfold across several dimensions. First, Japan will double down on its own defense posture. This includes expanding missile defense capabilities, enhancing surveillance in the East China Sea, and strengthening the self-defense forces' readiness near the Ryukyu Islands. Japan's new security legislation already allows for greater support of U.S. operations, and Tokyo knows that any conflict over Taiwan would inevitably draw Japan into the theater, whether by choice or by geography. Second, Japan will intensify diplomatic coordination with Washington. Behind closed doors, Tokyo will press U.S. officials for clarity about Trump's commitments to Taiwan. It will push for consistent messaging, stable signaling, and a reaffirmation of alliance obligations. Japan has no illusions. U.S. ambiguity may be strategic, but Trump's ambiguity can be improvised, and that improvisation is what worries Tokyo most. Third, Japan will expand its regional partnerships. The Xi-Trump call is a reminder that unilateral U.S. management of the Taiwan issue is inherently unstable. So Japan will quietly strengthen ties with Australia, South Korea, India, and even select Southeast Asian states. These relationships form a loose, evolving architecture aimed at preventing any single power, especially China, from dominating the region. Economically, Japan fears the ripple effects of uncertainty. Japanese companies are deeply embedded in Taiwan's semiconductor ecosystem. Any crisis would devastate supply chains in autos, electronics, defense technologies, and advanced manufacturing. Japan's economy cannot absorb such a shock lightly. So Tokyo watches every signal from Washington and Beijing with an almost financial sensitivity. But beyond strategy and economics lies something deeper: historical memory. Japan knows what happens when great powers miscalculate. It has lived through the consequences of war in Asia. It understands the devastation, the human cost, and the long-term scars. For Japan, therefore, the Taiwan crisis is not an abstract geopolitical puzzle. It is a potential repetition of history, something it is determined to avoid. And this is why Japan approaches the Xi-Trump call with a mix of relief, anxiety, and resolve. Relief that channels of communication remain open, anxiety that Trump's unpredictability may destabilize the region, and resolve to ensure that Japan, through careful diplomacy and strengthened defense, will not be caught unprepared in the next major geopolitical rupture of East Asia. Japan stands at the intersection of fear and responsibility, and the Xi-Trump dialogue only sharpens that reality. When I turn to the economic and technological dimensions of the Xi-Trump call, I see the core of why the Taiwan issue is not simply another territorial dispute. It is, in fact, the hinge on which the global digital economy now turns. Taiwan is not merely a geopolitical flashpoint. It is the world's most irreplaceable node in advanced semiconductor production. This single fact amplifies the stakes of every conversation between Washington and Beijing on Taiwan. And both leaders, whether they admit it or not, understand that a crisis over Taiwan would trigger the largest economic shock of our era. Let me be clear, TSMC is the beating heart of the global technology ecosystem, responsible for manufacturing the majority of the world's most advanced chips. These chips power smartphones, data centers, artificial intelligence, quantum research, autonomous vehicles, aerospace systems, and modern weapons platforms. Without Taiwan's foundries, the technological infrastructure of the United States, China, Japan, Europe, Indeed, the entire global economy would be thrown into chaos. This is why markets watch the Taiwan Strait with existential fear. A single misinterpreted comment from Trump, a single aggressive gesture from Beijing, a single naval incident, any of these events can send semiconductor stocks crashing, disrupt production schedules, and reorder global supply chains. Overnight, after the see Trump call, financial analysts will ask a simple question: is the risk of a Taiwan crisis rising or falling? And because the call involves Trump, whose unpredictability is profound, markets have no choice but to brace volatility. China's concerns are obvious. Taiwan's semiconductor industry is the technological bottleneck that prevents Beijing from achieving digital self-sufficiency. China wants American restraint not only to avoid conflict, but also to avoid greater Western coordination with Taiwan's tech sector. From Beijing's point of view, every U.S. arms sale, every political signal, every military patrol pushes Taiwan deeper into a defensive and technological alliance with Washington, an alliance that could permanently lock China out of the frontier chips. It needs to compete globally. For Trump, Taiwan's semiconductor dominance is not primarily a security issue. It is a bargaining chip. He understands that the United States depends on TSMC just as much as China does. This gives Washington enormous leverage, but also enormous vulnerability. Trump is acutely aware that American corporations from Apple to NVIDIA could be crippled by any disruption in Taiwan's chip supply. As a result, he alternates between threatening China and reassuring markets, creating a volatility that itself becomes a form of pressure. Japan, South Korea, and Europe, meanwhile, are painfully aware that any shock to Taiwan's semiconductor supply chain would devastate their economies. Their factories, their exports, their defense industries all depend on chips produced in Hsinchu. This is why Tokyo, Seoul, and Berlin monitor the U.S.-China dialogue with almost existential urgency. What concerns me most is the illusion that the Taiwan issue can be managed purely through military deterrence or diplomatic signaling. In truth, the Taiwan crisis is fundamentally an economic time bomb. A conflict would cripple global manufacturing, trigger mass unemployment across continents, and upend the financial system. The cost would be measured not in billions, but in trillions, perhaps restructuring the entire global economy. This is why the Xi-Trump call matters so profoundly. The economic and technological stakes are far greater than the military stakes alone. Taiwan is not just the front line of U.S.-China rivalry. It is the fragile fulcrum of the global technological future, and the world cannot afford for that fulcrum to crack. As I step back from the Xi-Trump phone call and survey the broader landscape, I am struck by an uncomfortable truth. The Taiwan crisis is no longer just a regional dispute. It has become the central stress point of an emerging global order, defined by rivalry, fragility, and profound interdependence. The question is no longer simply what Trump or Xi will do next. It is whether the international system can withstand the pressures being placed upon it by two nuclear-armed powers whose mutual suspicion is escalating faster than their diplomatic mechanisms can contain. The core challenge is philosophical as much as geopolitical. How do great powers manage conflict in a world where the consequences of miscalculation are global, irreversible, and immediate? Taiwan sits at the intersection of multiple fault lines: strategic, technological, economic, ideological, and each of these fault lines is widening. The Xi-Trump call, instead of easing tensions, brings these contradictions into sharper focus. The crisis now revolves around three dangerous illusions. The first illusion is the belief that ambiguity is sustainable. For decades, U.S. policy toward Taiwan relied on strategic ambiguity, a careful balance designed to deter both Beijing and Taipei from taking unilateral steps. But Trump's improvisational approach corrodes that balance. Ambiguity, when used without discipline, becomes confusion. And confusion in a nuclearized, technologically interconnected world. The second illusion is the belief that Taiwan can be leveraged without consequence. Trump's instinct to use Taiwan as a bargaining chip in wider negotiations may seem tactically effective, but it is strategically reckless. Taiwan is not a disposable asset. It is a modern, vibrant democracy of 23 million people whose fate should never be determined by transactional calculus. Treating Taiwan as a tool rather than a partner strips the situation of its moral dimension and invites Beijing to respond with equal ruthlessness. The third illusion is the belief that the Taiwan crisis can be contained. In reality, any significant confrontation in the Taiwan Strait would unleash economic, technological, and humanitarian shocks on a scale unprecedented in modern history. The semiconductor collapse alone would shake the foundations of global manufacturing. Shipping routes would be disrupted for months, perhaps years. Financial markets would convulse. Millions could be displaced. No country, certainly not the United States, China, Japan, or Taiwan, would emerge unscathed. So what then is the path forward? In my view, the world urgently needs a cooperative security framework for the Taiwan Strait, one that reduces the incentives for escalation and creates mechanisms for communication, conflict avoidance, and long-term stability. This framework should include a U.S.-China crisis hotline specifically for maritime and air encounters around Taiwan, clearer articulation of red lines from both sides to prevent misinterpretation, regional participation, especially Japan, to ensure that security dialogues reflect actual geographic risks, confidence-building measures, including limits on certain military deployments and increased transparency, economic cooperation that diffuses zero-sum logic and reestablishes shared interests in stability. But perhaps most importantly, the world must recognize that Taiwan should never be treated as a bargaining chip. Its people deserve a future shaped not by great power rivalry, but by peaceful democratic self-determination. Stability is not achieved through coercion or ambiguity. It is achieved through respect, communication, and international responsibility. The Xi-Trump call is a reminder of how close we stand to a precipice and how urgently we need a new architecture of peace. The future of Taiwan should not hinge on the unpredictable impulses of competing leaders. It should hinge on a collective commitment to ensure that the defining crisis of the 21st century does not become its defining catastrophe.